Greetings sailors and welcome to a Patreon replay, and this one is from Andy CX in the good old Shimakaze, which is, well, you know, a well-known quantity at this point. I think everybody pretty much knows what to expect from the Shima, unless somebody's doing something super wacky like using the 8km torps with torp acceleration, which is a very brave thing to do these days. In fact, it has been for quite a while, but I'm sure there are still some extremely brave souls out there that do give it a go anyway. But this isn't that. This is the 12km torps, and it's going to be a pretty okay game damage-wise. Maybe not the most exciting game in terms of action, but Andy's able to certainly do his fair share to help his team out. But it's definitely not going to be one of those games where it's sort of comes down to one or two people. This is definitely one of those games where it's more of a group effort, where Andy definitely does help out as part of that group. So we know the enemy Shima is in that cap, and Andy's put out a couple of torpedoes in their direction, but he's also radio located himself, and so this sneaking around the edge here, and he knows there is radar there, both the Salem and the Nevsky are there. It's kind of like it's a bit risky if that enemy Shima, who's almost certainly the one with the radio location, is telling their allies that he's sneaking down here, then yeah, it's not much of a surprise, and it might not even be the Shima, it might be, say, the Nevsky, which is almost certainly what just radared, because it was fairly short duration. So yeah, any kind of surprise value has basically gone out the window. But the good news is he's managed 2 torp hits, one into the Shima and one into, well, we're not sure if it's the Nevsky or the Salem just yet. But really, I think this is the point where I pulled back a bit more. And he's still skirting around, he's still located. His teammates want him to go in the cap, clearly, but when there's 2 radars there and a Shima who's as stealthy as you are, in theory, then I can kind of see why he hasn't. He could have sat in and blocked the cap and just sat behind the island and not managed to do much of anything, and instead he's chosen to take a more active role and actually try and maneuver so he can drop on things. Now that drop there almost certainly confirms that it's the Shima with radio location, because they, you know, dropped in his general direction, but they weren't much of a threat. And then we get another radar, which has to be the Salem, and it turns out, oh dear, they're right there. Now, it was the Salem that Andy has hit already, but as this is US radar, even with the Salem's shorter range, there's basically not much chance of him getting unspotted here. However, this Salem, and this is entirely luck on Andy's part, let's be honest, this Salem is not a particularly good shot, as it turns out. Normally you run into either a Salem or a Des Moines at this kind of range, and that's a bit of a pants-wetting moment. But no, not only are they not a good shot, but they're also firing AP shells. So Andy's really lost a very minimal amount of health, all things considered. And not only that, the Salem then runs into one of his torpedoes. I think this might be someone that's got themselves a Salem from the armory and maybe hasn't played that many high-tier games. I think this is somebody who's inexperienced with high-tier ships, and this ship in particular is definitely showing. So a little bump into the border. I'm not sure this was entirely intentional, because of course that really slows you down, not only in terms of having to make the turn, but it doesn't take very long for your engine power to get sapped away as well. However, the good news is that the Salem is now under all kinds of fire. His allies are pushing into the cap, although there is still a Shima around somewhere, but not actively in the cap anymore, and the Nevsky is also trying to run away. So that's one less radar, actually a secondary kill from their Kurfürst. Now, talking of the Shima, they almost certainly are in the B cap, and that just leaves the Nevsky on their own. And as they've been sat there trying to bow tank and really have left it way too late to make any kind of getaway, there's actually a decent chance Andy might hit some torps here. I'm not quite sure why they stuck it out, because it was pretty much just 2 cruisers and that destroyer, and the rest of the enemy team is on the other flank, although that hasn't stopped Andy's team actually taking the cap. So although things are kind of close on points right now, you can sort of see how this is starting to go in terms of map control. Now, it's entirely possible that there we go, just gets the last little bit of health from the kill. It's entirely possible that the enemy team might basically start doing sufficient damage to overcome the map control advantage, but that doesn't really seem to be happening in this case. I mean, quite often, I say quite often, sometimes it can happen that you get a seemingly advantageous position looking at the minimap, and it actually turns out to be a kind of a mirage, as it were. It ends up being the case that actually what you thought was a good position wasn't, because your team are taking way more damage than the enemy team, or they all rush forwards and start getting picked off, or they go in one by one and get picked off, or, you know, there's a variety of circumstances that can happen which can turn a seemingly reasonably winning position into a non-winning one. And in this case, looking at just the team lists versus the minimap, you know, this team's actually lost one more ship than the enemy team so far, but that's not such a big thing. It's just it can then start to snowball a bit. So, nice hit into the smoke with the Z-52, and then he takes out the carrier, who inexplicably was heading westwards towards enemy ships. And so that's actually a double strike, but for some reason, and this is a current patch replay, for some reason the awards are not actually showing up in the replay. So you'll see them on the score screens, but for some reason they're not showing up in the replay. Which, in terms of replay bugs, that one's a fairly minor one. It just means I have to actually remember what's going on. So that's the enemy team's aerial recon capability taken out. I don't know if the enemy carrier was any particular great shakes in terms of doing damage. I mean, they were bottom tier, so... no, they weren't. What am I saying? It's tier 10 carriers. Why did I think it was a tier 8 carrier? I don't know. Anyway, it's just some surprise in my voice as I corrected myself there. Anyway. Yeah, so tier 10 carrier, who doesn't seem to have been being particularly effective regardless of the fact they were tier 10 and not tier 8, as it turns out. And so maybe their loss isn't that big of a deal to the enemy team, but yeah, it's a big chunk of victory points they've just lost, and it's pretty much decisively turned against them at this point. And then that fourth kill with the Shima, the enemy Shima, who turned out to be kind of low health, that's just, you know, an extra little bit of damage, but more importantly, it's one kill closer to a Kraken. So all it needs is one more, and there are still a reasonable number of enemy ships left. Now, the enemy team did cap C eventually, but they don't seem to have inflicted nearly enough damage in the process, and they've taken quite a lot of damage themselves. So, yeah, this one really was just that slow, inevitable slide towards victory. But we can certainly say Andy has helped that along a fair bit with the amount of damage he's done and the kills he's gotten. The thing with this level of damage in a destroyer with torpedoes versus getting it in a cruiser with lots of fires, it's actually worth more because it's heavy damage versus fires, which can be healed a lot more effectively, especially at this tier when a lot more things have heals, as opposed to lower tiers, which is what I'm trying to say, where it's pretty much only battleships and the British light cruisers. So there's the fifth and final kill, so that's a Kraken. Well, I say final, there's an opportunity potentially to get more kills yet, but he's kind of running out of time in terms of victory points, and there's only 5 enemy ships left as well, so we'd have to get a little bit closer. And of course in the process his torps will reload, so at least he'll be able to have torps ready by the time he does get a bit closer. But he could be using a speed boost here to help himself out. I'm not entirely sure why he isn't. He's possibly just forgotten that it's available. So this was the enemy team's loss, I think it's fair to say, rather than this team's win. All this team had to do was not throw it, and not rush in, not panic, and that's what they did, and the enemy team just didn't particularly play effectively in comparison. Nonetheless, it's still been a pretty decent game in terms of the performance of the Shima, and it just goes to show that although there are many newer destroyers in this game, Shima remains popular for a reason. It still has fairly unparalleled ability at this tier to just do an awful lot of damage at once with those very high damage torpedoes. Although, of course, there is the Venom these days, which can pump out, I mean, they're lower damage torps, but it can pump out a lot of them with a quicker reload. So it's maybe not quite that huge strike potential that the Shima has just from fewer torps, but it can rack up a lot more torp hits potentially. So over 3k base XP, always impressive. He had the Kraken, double strike, and 2 dev strikes as well. He pretty well showcased the power of these Japanese torpedoes and had a rather good result. Although I think even if he'd done less well, I think the team still would have won. It just might have taken a little bit longer. It was one of those matches. And he did have that kind of kill secure on the Nevsky, so he sort of kill secured his way to the Kraken, but nonetheless it's always quite nice when you do get a Kraken. I've said this before, but I do wish there were more milestone battle achievements for set numbers of kills, because it's basically just the Kraken. You compare it to World of Tanks, which has these kind of gradations, and even gives you awards based on getting certain numbers of kills for vehicles of different types, of different tiers kind of thing. So yeah, World of Tanks I think is a bit more rewarding in that sense, but in the economic sense, I mean, World of Warships definitely wins hands down. So I want to do a quick apology before I finish this. I've been a bit lax this week with videos and streams and whatnot, and partly it was the internet issues I was having last week, but also I've hit another patch of rough sleep which just knocks onto everything, and Sam's kind of not helping because he has a certain wake up time where he wants breakfast every morning, and so I end up inevitably having to get up and then go back to bed again, and it isn't necessarily the best way to sleep. So although I've been trying to get to bed earlier to accommodate Sam, I don't know if I've been that successful yet, so I just need to persist, and hopefully I'll get there. Hopefully, fingers crossed, because it's no fun being tired all the time. So that's it for this Patreon supporter replay. If you have enjoyed it, you can do all the usual things underneath the video, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.